narratives. Welcome to this session on Europe and the Battle of Narratives. As I said before, we will have the opportunity of break down the key points of what is happening nowadays together with Director of General Communications for the European Parliament, Jaume Duch, and the political consultant, author of The Strong Man, Hans Kribbe. Everything communicates. We understand in this way life, the narrative with its different voices, talks about the different voices of human experience. From this perspective, life is not more than a story. Human beings can not stop their need of narrating life, and they need reciprocity to be able to be listened to, interpreted, and shared. Narrating has two aims, moving and explaining. So we manufacture stories and we storytell to give sense to our lives, to understand what's strange in our human condition. Narrative is a dialogue between what is expected and what happened, and between what's foreseen and what's really happening, between memory and imagination. As psychologist Jerome Bruner, one of the fathers of the cognitive revolution, said in one of his books. But we also narrate, as we will see today, to have an influence, to have a spot in the world, and to dominate. The story of humanity is the sum of stories, of narrations told from one generation to the other. And this is what storytelling did for many years. These narrations later on became part of the imagery and medieval architecture, and this was also used by the church to educate morally and to transmit their doctrine to the masses. And later on, written text diversified in its form and was used throughout the planet. Now, in the society of media, images and messages emerge in a faster way and in multiple media. Sometimes we have true news and fake news that intermix and accelerate thanks to the multiplying effect of social networks. There are narrations that extend in time, that have an imminent role on the destiny of individuals. That's the meta story, like the big political economic ideologies. The world is now part of a new era of rivalry between big powers, with three big powers, the US, China, and Russia. Beyond the military and economic power, the three powers also dominate, each in their own way, the art of narrative, a soft power that is really important and significant to build collective identity to some allies and be able to have more influence. The question is, where is Europe, the European Union now in this time of geopolitical reconfiguration? Does the EU have an efficient narrative, or does it need to change things and adapt to the new reality? What are its strengths and weaknesses in the construction of a narrative of collective identity and in projecting itself as a world power, if we want to be so? We live in a battle of narratives, constant, around the issues that dominate the world. We need to understand the different positions if we want to find common ground. This is something that was said by Mr. Borrell in the presentation of his blog, Una Ventana al Mundo. So to help us understand the battle of narratives that we are part of, we have this afternoon the analytic and privileged view of two wonderful speakers, Jaume Duch and Hans Kribbe. They will both present their viewpoints to later on have a discussion where I will be asking questions, and we will also be very happy to hear the questions of the audience. We want this to be as dynamic as possible. So let's get started. And I start by introducing Jaume Duch, Director General for Communication of the European Parliament since February 2017. He's a spokesperson since 2016, because since then he's At the time, he was director of media of that same institution, where he was there first working as an assistant. In 1989, he passed his exam and as number 1 to work as a civil servant in the chamber, and he's published different articles on issues related to European institutions, European law, and European communication, and he also participates in different courses and seminars like today.
Hans Kribbe, que es asesor.
We also have Hans Kribbe, who is a political advisor and worked in Europe, has worked in Europe for many years and understands its limits. He was an advisor in issues that had to do with competition for in the times of Durão Barroso, and he also worked there in the times of Prodi, and he's advised different governments in the Middle East and also the Kremlin till 2014 are being around its European strategy. Before the pandemic, he published The Strong Men about the powerful men like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping from China, or Erdogan from Turkey. And we also have Donald Trump in the book that is now not part of the game. We will see if definitely or not. And beyond their differences, Kribbe believes they share common characteristics like being not very democratic, before which Europe has to stop being naive and start to speak the language of power. Since 2006, the intelligence unit of the economics works on a demographic index that talks about the state of democracy in different countries in the world. And in its last edition, in 2021, this index reflects that in less than the population, around 45%, lives in some kind of democracy. So globally, the data is the worst since this started to be published in 2006. So the viewpoint of how we're evolving in Europe is less and less universal, and this is a big challenge because the background that we observe is a battle between democracy and autocracy in the world, and this fight and what the EU will do and will have to do is what Jaume will be speaking about, and I give him the floor. Thank you, Catalina, for your introductory words and for talking about the main issues that I will be addressing. And thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm very pleased to start my year in Santander and not in Brussels, at least this year. Maybe you've been able to follow with attention many of the interventions of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, since the Russian aggression of the country started 6 months ago. In his interventions before the EU Parliament, and later on using this same digital technique before different parliaments. If you've listened to him, probably you are aware of how important the messages to the public opinion are in the most complex moments of the life of a country. Messages that in some cases develop narratives that fight to be imposed in a world of disinformation and where overinformation are more and more important. There's nothing new here. We are probably all able to quote some of the historic phrases stated by Churchill or de Gaulle during the Second World War. But now the battle of communication and of narratives is more complex and more determinant. We all know that the Ukraine war is not something only happening in its country. It's an economic war that affects us fully as citizens of the European Union, but it's likewise a war of communication in which we're also involved whether we like it or not. And these are some of the elements I will be addressing. First of all, I will start to explain what we're talking about when we speak about the battle of narratives. What do we mean by that? What are the different narratives? What's the narrative of the EU, if we have one? And that's probably the most important part of the discussion, if it's our own narrative or if it's universal and it's shared with other third countries or regions in the world, or whether we believed it was and it's not. And in fact, the figures that Catalina has just given us should make us reflect on this. Secondly, against which narratives do we fight, or what are the narratives that we have to confront as democratic countries? What are who are those that are trying to weaken our narrative? For example, Russia. We will be speaking about Russia, and China, that does so in a more explicit manner. And we have time to see what are the weapons of this confrontation and how when we oppose, what does Russia do to introduce its narrative in our public debate, and what else could we do as Europeans in the EU to defend our own narrative. So very quickly, what do we make reference to when we speak about narratives? I take the description from Professor José Luis Manfredi. He says that strategic narrative is the narrative that allows the political actors to explain their position in their international order, their leadership, or their historic contribution that allows them to legitimate their own values or disqualify the values of others. In both cases, narrative should be useful to legitimate decisions regarding public matters in open and permeable societies like ours. And I would like to give an example. If I invade a country, something that I can't do, I need to support that decision before my public opinion through a narrative that works. And if it's possible to have an influence on the public opinion of other countries or of the countries I know I'm going to be confronted with some way or another. I'm going to tell ours that Ukraine was never a country, that it was always Russian, that it's full of Nazis, and the public opinions of other countries. I will have to tell that I have to protect myself from a future attack of NATO, that little by little are getting closer to my borders and so on and so forth. But if I decide to help the invaded country, I have to oppose this narrative. I don't have to allow them to be victorious in our territory, and therefore I have to defend and promote my own narrative. And I would like to say that according to me, when we speak about the battle of narratives in the world nowadays, we really are speaking about something even more important, and that is the battle between society models, or better said, a situation in which someone from the inside or outside attacks our own model, and therefore the values and rights that this model is based on. So this is a battle between a democratic model and one or several autocratic models. But this battle of narratives doesn't start with the invasion of Ukraine or with a pandemic. It goes back in time to the moment in which ideas and policies defended by the Kremlin were completely antithetic, and mainly when Russia starts to try and recover its role internationally. As we all know, this is documented in the Brexit campaign, in the American elections in favor of Donald Trump, or in the presidential Macron links, or in the referendum in Holland, or in the elections in Catalonia, always trying to have an influence on the public opinions of this country, and in some cases quite successfully. Most of us at the time were not really aware of the real consequences of actions that really had a direct effect on us, and even less of those that have taken place in many other places in the world, and that no doubt have contributed for us to be sure that we are losing the democracy in the planet. We are not in the times of Francis Fukuyama and his theory of the end of history. The world is nothing like what we foresaw. The 21st century has nothing to do with the 20th century. Concepts and realities like globalization and multilaterality are in crisis. The role of the U.S. is questioned even internally by the Americans themselves. The world is more multipolar. Europe stops being so central. And during the COVID pandemic and during the Ukraine war, we see that they are accelerating some of these trends. Therefore, when we speak about manipulation of information, or when we talk about these foreign actions, we see what are the practical consequences and how they are a real threat for our world to continue existing. The global battle of narratives is at its highest point now with the Ukraine war, and if we look at the explicit or tacit actions outside Europe, like in Latin America or Africa, we cannot say that Europe is winning this battle. Fighting against propaganda from free societies is not always easy. And when we talk about the battle of narratives of the food crisis caused by Russia, if you read what the High Representative says in his blog, or try and find the how this Russian attack has been condemned by Latin American Parliament, you won't find it. What are the main elements of the Russian narrative and how do they try to impose it? Very quickly, and to do so, the most practical thing is to quote the article of an MP in the Congress, Pau-Marie Close. In a recent article, he made reference to Professor Marlène Laurel, one of those has been studying what is happening in Russia, and he speaks about three narratives in Russia: a red narrative, a white narrative, and the red emphasizes the memory of the USSR, consumerism, and they defend the territorial expansion of Russia, seen as an economic and social project. The white one invokes the religious orthodox principles, a nostalgia not only of communism but of the Tsars that had traditional values in their territories, a narrative that considers that the weakening of Russia has meant antagonic cultures to their values, cultures that tolerate practices like alcohol and drugs, or that provide protection to collectives that should be marginalized, like the Jews, or even more recently LGBTI groups, and a brownish narrative that talks about neo-fascist elements, that talks about the need of confronting in a violent manner the internal and external threats. Internally, they talk about fighting liberal orientations that don't take Russia to their destiny, and externally they recommend Russia that they should leave the Euro-Asian world, a role that they should demand by confronting themselves to other nationalisms that want to deny this. Three narratives that can be combined according to the situation and the person you're speaking to and the aim you want to achieve. The expansion of the international effect of these narratives is based on a strategy that is perfectly orchestrated and is consistent through time. First of all, Russia is using all the communication instruments that they are able to have at their reach to disinform, starting with the traditional audiovisual media like Russia Today and Sputnik, and complementing this with a dense network of bots that try to achieve division and confrontation in social networks. In many cases, also with feedback and with Iran. This is something interesting to point out, creating the arguments that are opposite to the European view. We saw this clearly throughout the first months of the COVID crisis, when Russia and China both developed or promoted campaigns to show their supposed superiority to fight the pandemic, and later on, when they weren't able to achieve this, to become or make the campaign of who was going to get the vaccine first, trying to also support the anti-vaccine movements in EU countries. A fundamental element in the battle of narratives is the fact that in many cases the strategy is not only imposing one view, but in creating doubts or even internal conflicts regarding the internal vision and the practical management of this view by politicians and a specific society. That is to say, the degree of success of the campaigns, in this case of the Kremlin campaigns, in many cases shows the problems and weaknesses of the continent. They make use of freedom of speech and plural politics in our civil society. So now that there's more inequality, there is a way of more messages coming in that have specific effects and affect the credibility of the institutions of the countries and of the EU. So they are Trojan horses. So these are the problems that we face at each moment, whether we're talking about climate change, the pandemic, or the difficulties of migratory flows. They are not problems that come from outside. They already exist, but they are exploited in a different way. So the battle is how to describe them. Are they simply challenges of our time? They're the kind of issues, smaller or bigger, that all societies have to face in a democratic manner. That would be our narrative, the Western narrative. Or are they, and this is what the opposing narrative would say, they are the test of the failure of democracy, and that only a different regime, an autocratic regime, will be able to solve successfully. An important element in a democratic society is public debate, listening to different views, being in disagreement, or working to convince them of our own positions. Democracy cannot work without the commitment and participation of all society. In some cases, therefore, it will be easy to decide certain things, but in other cases will be difficult or very difficult. The process of listening or waiting the views of each and every side. A dialogue can take a lot of time, and in some cases it might seem confusing or even chaotic if we compare it to the decisions that are made with no debate from an autocratic leader. Something normal in any country, and even more for obvious reason, which is this discussion process that takes time and sometimes seems to complicate things. It is typical and logic to believe that in a member state, imagine even more in the EU, where there's more actors and more need of coordination and discussion. And of course, there's always going to be external actors that try to make use of these differences to make the democratic system seem weak, or even to prophesize about its collapse. In fact, and now I'm referring to some of the roles of the Foreign Affairs Service in Europe. It considers this narrative of the imminent collapse of the EU or of the free European society as one of the main narratives used nowadays by the Kremlin, and that works really well in crucial moments and in moments like, for example, the migratory crisis of 2015. The 1.5 million Syrian refugees that got to European borders were a challenge that was not well solved, but the Russian or pro-Kremlin propaganda made the most to describe an apocalyptic situation that was bringing Europe to a systemic collapse, something that didn't happen, but it is true that there was damage regarding elections for some parties or governments. Something similar happens in the case of demonstrations against decisions made by the institutions in our countries. The right to express your disagreement with the government and their policies is part of democracy, and all European citizen has the right to demonstrate in the streets. In fact, these movements are part of the democratic European tradition, and they speak more about their strength and about its possible weakness. But it's in Putin's Russia where they go war, or those that demonstrate about the war are the ones that are put in jail. But we see how in these narratives they make the most, sometimes with images, the fact that EU member states in Western Europe, there are citizens that demonstrate against the measures put in place by their governments. One last element typical of Russian narratives is that element in which it is Western democracies and not authoritarian systems, the ones that are governed by an elite that is evil and that works against the interests of people. It is an ancient narrative, more than 100 years old, and the absence of evidence regarding this, curiously, sometimes becomes the fake test of its existence. How powerful are these people that they're able to hide all of this? And once we get here, does Western Europe have its own narrative? My view is that yes, it does. And I believe that it is very well described and said, first of all, in Article 2 of the Treaty of the EU, and secondly, the different articles of the constitutions of the different member states. It's the narrative of the democratic democracies, values, rights, freedoms, the way of life, the economy, society, and the simultaneous defense of individual and collective rights. But for many years, it seemed that it wasn't necessary either to defend nor promote it. We gave it for granted, and that was the logic when we organized our countries, and this was the way in which we will continue to be successful. You had to bring together the promotion of multilateral bodies, and we had to work with third countries. But now we see that this is not so. After countries like, for example, China offer a similar catalog without almost no requirements. Therefore, there is a narrative, but we now start to see that there is a strategy to defend and disseminate it.
And the first question is to know whether we need to update his narrative or otherwise put on the table a new vision, a new approach with some new elements. We have to look into these new elements, the future of the EU, among most of it among those projects that are more in line with the concerns of the new generations, the ones we have to convince. For example, the role played by the EU as a champion of the sustainable transition, the Green Deal. The President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, defined it as our feet on the moon, and maybe it is a clue, but or we might need to reinforce the European sovereignty in a world that is more and more unstable. It is what defends Macron, Josep Borrell, and the EU, following the track that was laid down by Juncker when he talked for the first time about the European sovereignty. And at the same time, the Ukraine war is leading us to the going back to the initial narrative that was the one which did not help us to communicate about the real sense of what we are doing. It might be something positive regarding the new generations. We did not know how to explain to youth what was this new EU. We put examples such as Erasmus, the cheap flight, the local flight, and other elements that are rational but are not really emotional. So instead of selling the EU, we were just selling a discount card. So now we have to go talk about the essential questions: peace, dictatorship, autocracy, and now we are able to tell youth that Europe is not only a place but also an idea. As Jean-Henri Lévy said, it might be our main narrative, but for that we need many things. We need political will, we need commitment, and we need to progress in the European integration. We need faces, political leaders that are able to represent ourselves. We need strong and independent media. And most of all, we also need to recover certain pride of what we are, what we have done in the past, and we have to compare it every day with what we have or not have, or they don't have in the rest of the world, and we will have to be able to say that and to defend it. It seems quite evident, but I'm not sure we are doing that. I will end up here. I could talk also about the fight between different narratives and fight against this lack of information. What is the EU doing to fight against this lack of information or this information that is coming from China, Russia, and that is also coming sometime from the EU itself? That's all, and no one will defend better the democracy than ourselves. Thank you.
Gracias, Jaume. Pasamos.
Thank you, Jaume. We are going to give the floor to Hans Kribbe. And apart from an economic and military force, major powers need a narrative to be a part of the geopolitical scenario. Hans Kribbe is going to explain us why this narrative is important and what is the power of narratives. He's going to tell us how Russia and China have rediscovered recently the narrative, and last but not least, he will talk about the narrative power of Europe and the narrative it can be developed. Thank you. Yours is the floor.
Catalina, for the kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here at this frankly fantastic location in Santander. I want to start by quoting Mao Zedong, who is, as some of you will know, the founding father of communist China. And he once said famously that power grows out of the barrel of a gun. So he captured the quite common view that politics and geopolitics also is essentially decided by who has the most guns, or the best technology, or the best intelligence and strategic foresight. And if you look at the world today, there's no doubt that Mao was, in some regards, right. The greatest powers in the world also have the greatest armies, the best intelligence, the strongest economies. But what I want to argue is that to become a geopolitical player in the world, which is what many in Europe want these days, Europe not only needs to invest more in defense, foresight, strategic decision making, or in technology and supply chain resilience, but it must also invest in a more compelling story about itself, about who we are as Europeans, and how we fit into the broader world. We are entering into a new era of geopolitical rivalry, and the key powers in that battle, China, Russia, and of course the United States, they owe their influence to three things, I would argue: their military and strategic ability to act, their economy and technological superiority, but also their narrative and discursive power. And by the latter power, I mean the ability to rally support for one's cause domestically, but also internationally. So narrative power, in a nutshell, is the power to dictate norms and the power to frame events such as wars and to decide essentially who is in the right and who is in the wrong. Narrative power is also the power to create collective identities, notions of a we or a them, which are of course very powerful in politics in general. And finally, narrative power is all about conferring political legitimacy. And legitimacy, if you have it as a ruler, attracts allies and supporters. And if you have more supporters and allies, you are likely to come out on top in the battle. So the power of storytelling in politics is enormous. And you could say that power doesn't grow out of the barrel of a gun, but out of a story, a good story, well told. And you can see this clearly in the war that is going on at the moment, where both Russia, but also Ukraine, really understand extremely well how you can destroy your enemy, not just with guns and bombs, but also with stories. Now, if you look at the contemporary world, and you look at it through the prism of narrative power, I think there are a number of things, important trends that demand our attention. And the first is that mainly Russia and China, but also other emerging anti-liberal powers, have rediscovered narrative power in a big way. The second trend is that the Western post-Cold War narrative is losing appeal globally and even domestically. Think of Trump, think of, in Europe, think of Orban, or think of the support that Putin is still getting for his war in the global south. And the third trend, or the third fact, is that Europe in particular at this moment remains quite underdeveloped, not just as a military power, as we kind of all know, but also as a narrative power. But let me, before I come to Europe, say something about Russia and China, who are I think, beating us in terms of narrative. In the global battle between narratives, I think Russia and China have the upper hand at the moment. Now, if you go back a bit in time, at the end of the Cold War, so this is in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, certainly for Russia, but also for China, whatever narrative power they possessed at that moment went up in smoke. There was then only one military and economic superpower left, but also just one narrative power in the world, which was the United States of America, or more generally the West. And its narrative, the US narrative, liberal narrative, became the universal story of mankind, of processes like modernization, democratization, globalization, that all societies and peoples in the world were supposed to converge towards. So in Russia, country already mentioned, of course, this narrative quickly began to filter down into domestic politics. So in the 90s and in the early 2000s, this became a big problem for Putin. The United States and its Western allies, Putin came to realize, had acquired the power to undermine the legitimacy of whoever ruled in Russia or indeed in other countries such as Ukraine. So if you think back to the Maidan revolution, for Putin this was a clear signal that the West's discursive power was enormous. And for Putin, and also for Xi in China, this ability to dictate global norms was intolerable for obvious reasons. And they slowly began to employ quite sophisticated narrative strategies designed specifically to break up this Western monopoly on stories. And this, we've seen this now for a number of years, leads to a fundamental shift away from the post-Cold War era to something else. And we're moving away from a one-story world to in which the United States essentially was the hegemonic narrative power, to what you could call a multi-story world in which China, Russia, and also some others are trying to reconquer their what they call narrative sovereignty, the sovereignty to tell their own stories and to set their own norms. Now, we may not like those strategies. They are very disruptive, but from the point of view, from the strategic point of view of China and Russia, they are perfectly rational. And these strategies have four important pillars. The first is that they shield domestic audiences from Western media, but not just media, also popular culture, books, films, cinema, and NGOs. Second, they intervene quite aggressively, as we've already heard, with disinformation campaigns in the West, amongst others to undermine elections. Three, they use very aggressive also public diplomacy campaigns to promote certain narratives, such as China's mask diplomacy during the COVID pandemic. And most interestingly, and fourthly, I think, is that they are actually spending quite a lot of effort into creating a powerful national and historically grounded story that manages to mobilize support in their own countries, but actually also internationally. So I'm gonna look a bit at China as an example of such a story. And this is a story that the Chinese leader, Xi, has been propagating now for, I guess, a decade or so. And it's called the China Dream. And one reason why this story is so powerful in China, but also in parts of the world, is that it simply has all the elements that make a good story. So it has, for example, a clearly identifiable hero, which is a lead character, and it's China itself, of course. And it's a hero that, moreover, has a very compelling, dramatic history and a past that explains what China is and where it's coming from. And it's also a history that has lots of setbacks in it. And it therefore reveals something about the hero's destiny, his future, the overcoming of those setbacks. And that's something that involves struggle and sacrifice. Now, this story, the China story fits this scheme quite nicely, and it goes a bit like this. So a long time ago, China was the greatest civilization on earth. They called it the Middle Kingdom. And then 200 years ago, a century of humiliation, they call it. China was overrun by barbarians, the Europeans. In 1860, they burned down the Emperor's summer palace. catastrophe, humiliation. However, 100 years ago, or even less, China began the process of regaining its strength under the leadership, of course, of its great helmsman Mao. And at first, these painful reforms, they hurt, but they were necessary to root out the flaws of imperial China, and eventually they bore fruit, and soon China, this is the China dream, soon it will be again what it once was, the greatest civilization on the face of the planet, and the West. The Europeans need to be humble again and show respect. So even outside China, other states are, I think, attracted to this particular story. And that's because China and Russia also are saying what political elites and maybe populations too in many countries in the global south actually think, which is that the US and Europe should stop dictating norms and values to others. This is what they think. And we in the West, of course, have a slightly different view. We have the habit of presenting ourselves as the sole keeper of universal truths and values, of human rights, international legal and democratic norms. In a nutshell, we think of ourselves as the final arbiter, the final judge of right and wrong, a bit like the Pope once was in Christendom. So our politicians go around the world telling others how to behave and what not to do, how to run free and fair elections, how to treat women and LGBTQ communities, how to fight corruption, how to protect the Amazon rainforest, and so on. Now, I don't know about your experience, but if I travel a bit around the world, it's pretty clear that most people find our habit, Europe's or Western's habit, of playing the Pope quite arrogant, hypocritical, and obnoxious. For example, when we tell the world Russia is breaking sacred norms by invading another country and therefore needs to be punished, when we tell that to the Indians, the Brazilians or the Africans, part of the response is, well, since you tend to break those norms yourself when it suits you, as for example in Iraq or in Libya, is this norm really that sacred? Or is it only sacred when your own interests are at stake? That's the reply that comes back. And the truth is, and it's not easy to deal with, so the truth is that big chunks of the non-Western world more readily identify with autocratic China, which is rising from a condition of poverty in a bit like other countries, and also from colonial subjugation by the West, than with the United States or Europe. And Putin and Xi also, they know this all too well. And this is, for example, I'm going to quote Putin from a speech last week, 16 August, in Moscow. He says, here I'm quoting, he says, an increasing number of countries and peoples are choosing a path of free and sovereign development based on their own distinct identity, traditions, and values. They are being opposed, still Putin, they are being opposed by Western globalist elites who are doing all they can to keep hold onto hegemony and power. They are attempting to retain countries and peoples in the grip of what is essentially a neo-colonial order. End quotation. So this is what Putin says, and we may think it's ridiculous coming out of his mouth because he's invading another country, but it does resonate quite well in the world. He gets support for this. Take, for example, Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. Now, Erdogan may not like what China is doing to the Uyghur population in Western China. He may not like what Russia is doing to Ukraine, but in the bigger picture, in the bigger scheme of things, Turkey is not always supporting us on the issue of Ukraine because fundamentally its geopolitical goal is not all that dissimilar from Russia's. Turkey wants to be, Erdogan's Turkey wants to be a sovereign agent in the world. And to do so, he needs a world in which the West no longer dictates what the rules are. So no wonder Russian oligarchs and businessmen and also tourists still find safe harbor in Turkey. And no wonder why other countries such as Brazil, India, South Africa, for example, announced only last month in July that they will be working with China and Russia on plans to become less dependent on the US dollar as the global reserve currency. So, the war on narratives is not necessarily going well for us. So where does this leave Europe and our quest for narrative sovereignty? Well, I think we Europeans need to realize that the post-Cold War consensus, the so-called liberal rules-based order underpinned by US power, is over. This is painful to hear for Europeans because the EU itself, the most important vehicle of European unity, the EU itself is an intrinsic part of that multilateral supranational order. Let's be honest, the EU is not a state. So the United States, which is a state, can always say the global rules-based order breaking down is a terrible thing. But we can always follow Henry Kissinger and his realist advice and act like big and powerful states have always acted in history. But for the EU, this is clearly more difficult. The EU may be big, but it's not a state. Still, this is something that we have to learn to do. And there's growing willingness in Europe at the moment, and partly because of the war, to learn how to act like a great power too. Partly because of Ukraine, but also because of Trump, China, Erdogan, and other reasons. So many people in Brussels and Europe today agree the EU needs to think more strategically and geopolitically about resource dependency, energy, for example. And many politicians agree we need to be less naive about security. But this is not where we should stop. We also have to think more strategically about narrative power. So we've heard also earlier that Russia and China possess really quite sophisticated narrative strategies, fully adapted to the demands of the age. And if we Europeans truly want to be geopolitical, we will need narrative strategies that can match those. However, when it comes to narrative power, the EU, in my opinion, has been no less naive than when it comes to hard power. Technocratic Brussels and narrative have never been a happy marriage. So take, for example, the global gateway. That this is the EU's answer to China's Belt and Road, which is a massive investment program set up by Beijing for building transport infrastructure, port facilities, railways, bridges, transportation hubs throughout Eurasia, but also in the Balkans, for example. Now, to begin with, it is, of course, very encouraging, I think, that the EU has taken this initiative of putting out a rival program that does the same thing. But what is less good is that there actually is very little narrative around that supports the global gateway. If I ask this audience, who of you have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think quite a few people would say yes. If I were to ask the esteemed audience who has heard of the global gateway, honestly, who has? I'm not counting the EAS officials here in the front, but who has heard of the Global Gateway Initiative? Yeah, so I think it is important that this initiative exists, but it needs to be wrapped into a better story, a sales pitch, which is what the Chinese are doing much better than us at the moment. So I want to end on a final thought, and if you look at Europe today, and of course people are thinking about narrative strategy now, and I think what you can see to become visible is a growing appetite, for example, to ban foreign and state-sponsored disinformation from social media. So you see politicians putting pressure on the likes of Facebook and Twitter to remove such disinformation from their platforms. And Trump was thrown off Twitter, for example. And we have a dedicated task force in Brussels now that exposes and counters Russian state propaganda, which is good. And we have Russian state broadcasters like RT and Sputnik, and they are under sanctions now, so they can't really broadcast their content in Europe. So like China and Russia, we've begun shielding our own public from foreign narratives. But blocking such foreign narratives only goes so far. It only is part of the work. Because you also have the wider world. You can only block it from a European audience and not from the wider world. And moreover, in our liberal world, unlike in Russia, we have freedom of speech principles. Yeah? So there's only so far you can go with blocking illiberal information. So the bigger prize the bigger goal, I think, should be to develop a more offensive narrative strategy in Europe. And I think the first and the most fundamental challenge is to rethink the story, fundamentally rethink the story of Europe that we want to tell the world, and also ourselves, by the way. And similar to the China story I mentioned earlier, I think that story needs to have a clearly identifiable hero, a subject, a main character. And that hero, moreover, would need a history. He would need to have a past, and that past needs to be filled with trials and tribulations, and there must be a sense of forward progression and of overcoming those obstacles. And our hero, which is of course Europe, would need some destiny, a goal, an end. So yeah, we have the China dream. Can there be such a thing as a Europe dream? And if so, what is it? Now, this is a question that I'm not sure we have really thought about long and hard enough. And if we make such a story, we have to make this story also uniquely about Europe. So we should avoid the old habit of turning the history of Europe into the history of the whole world, leaving no room for other stories. Now, as I already said, so I don't think such a story now exists, but I think it's exactly the story that we need to develop. And this won't be easy, and again, because Europe is not a state, so it's not even clear what Europe is, unlike the United States or Russia or China. And the continent's history, it needs a history. The continent's history is also, as we all know, extremely complicated. But still, as an inspiring willpower, and I think certainly the HRVP would agree, Mr. Borrell would agree that we are an inspiring willpower. It is important that we invest not just in guns and military security, which is happening, but also in narrative power. So thank you for your attention.
Gracias, Hans.
Thank you, Hans. You're saying that the main challenge that we face is to rethink Europe's history, which is complex, to see what we want to tell the world, but also ourselves. So the question is, you both agree on the fact that Europe has to foster its narrative, but is it necessary for the EU to make a total change, a full change, or only a partial change of the paradigm? Does the EU need to speak in a clear way with the language of power, clearly showing with strength what are its interests in the world, and to update its narrative with more ambition of boxing in the League of the Great, proclaiming with pride that Europe is a unique civilization in the world that is worth its defense, to change the American dream for the European dream. And my question too is, do we have audience in Europe that will say yes to this idea? Well, there's many questions in one, but I will sum it up first. Those that have to be convinced that the best place in the world to live in the 21st century continues to be Europe, or with some exceptions, has to be us. And if we believe it, we have to work so that it continues to be so, because as I said before, no one will do it for us. The EU, and we all know its history, we all know why it starts, we know that it's a response to 2 world wars, and that it continues to allow us more than 70 years of peace, which was unthought of in previous centuries. But we also know that up till now, Europe has mainly been present at an economic level, and we all remember that it's an economic giant, but small politically. But it doesn't matter that we are small politically, because we go hand in hand with our big brother, that is the US. That is not so, or is only in some cases, or only in specific moments in times, and it stopped being so with Obama. And this changed even more radically with Donald Trump. Now we are in a different situation, but we don't know if it's a parenthesis. So that means that if we want to continue maintaining our life model, we cannot be just an economic union. We also have to be a political union and a political power. And when I say political power, I don't mean a world power. We have to be realistic. We are a world power in many things, many of them very positive, but we're never going to be leaders worldly in other things. For example, in the military or weapons level, but we can be like Russia. The only 2 powers of the next 20-30 years are going to be US and China, not Russia. Russia is also at another level, category, or division that should be ours. So to do so, we need to do things seriously, and I believe we're already doing so. Sometimes we're always trying to find what's negative and what we don't know, instead of focusing on what we already have put in place. And this week in Santander, we are highlighting many of the things that are being done. Things that months, weeks ago were unthinkable. A year ago, in this same course, if someone had said the EU will use part of its budget to fund weapons, to be able to offer these weapons to a third country that has been invaded by a power like Russia, everyone would have thought that this person was crazy, but the EU is doing that now. And we are in the battle of communication and in the economic battle with Russia at a level that probably we didn't imagine we would be at a year, 2 or 3 years back. So we're doing our homework. Of course, it is difficult and very complex, and we are not a state, so everything is much more complex. It's 27 times more complex than decision making at a state level. But we are achieving things. We have 6 sanctions packages. The last one more complex than the first one, and the following, if we get it, will also be more complex than the previous one. But we are doing it. We're putting in the effort, and I'm going back to what Hans said. What we have to do and what we need to improve is to sell this narrative. This narrative goes through the beliefs and values that we defend, but also through the things that we do to defend them. So I insist on seeing the glass half full, because the EU is full of people that only see the glass half empty.
Yes, we need to change the whole narrative. But I do think we need to update it and recognize that we are in a different era. And this is an era of competition. So whereas we come from an era where we could take for granted that our story was seen as the one and only true story, we now live in a world where stories compete. For example, one theater of this competition is Africa. Now the projections are that Africa's importance in the world is only going to increase in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Its population is going to be the biggest on the planet. And one of the really big strategic questions for the future is whether Africa will develop deeper partnerships with China than with us. And in order to prevent that from happening, we have got to invest in the story that we are telling to the Africans, and not just the story, but it's the whole demeanor. And I think there is a bit of work, to be honest, that we have to do, because we come from a history where we are accused of being hypocritical and arrogant, and we need to find a way to address that. So we need to go in, tell the same story perhaps about our way of life being the best, but maybe in a slightly different way. And if we are accused of being hypocritical, then let's stop being hypocritical about it. Yeah, if we, if the response is, you guys talk a lot about values and principles, but you're only pursuing your own interest. Yeah. Well, I mean, let's be clear about what our interests are. Let's not be ashamed about what we stand for, and make it about business, not necessarily about improving the world for the common good and for values and so on. So I do think the narrative needs to evolve. It needs to become more realist, more strategic, more geopolitical. And this is not done in one day, but I think that work needs to start.
Volviendo o al hilo de la idea esta de que
Going back to the idea that we always tend to see the glass half empty. If we look at this last 2 years that have been so difficult with the pandemic and the war, and everything that the EU has done, because there are decisions that are historic, that 2 years or a year back we couldn't even imagine. So it is true that von der Leyen's Commission has faced exceptional situations, and they have overcome them with quite a lot of success, I would say. Should the EU, when talking to its own citizens, but also other citizens outside the EU, create a powerful narrative of the success when facing problems, and what should be the ideas that we should focus on to continue building that renewed European narrative? Well, in September, October 2020, the EU had on the table different dossiers that were really important. They were discussing the recovery plan, the 750 billion. They were also negotiating the European's budget for the next 7 years. There was also a negotiation of a regulation for the protection of the rule of law in the member states, and we were ending the divorce agreement with British. All of these were issues that were being addressed at this time. And in my office, in my job as a communicator of the Parliament, thought if in the next 3 months we haven't been able to close one of these issues, we will really face credibility problems. In December of that same year, all of these issues were closed and adequately, and in some cases, I would say in a really good manner. This has done at a time that was very complex in the middle of the pandemic, with a difficult political situation, with public opinions that were very nervous, but it was done, and it was done well. Have we been able to sell this? I don't know, maybe partly yes, partly not. Yes, some people have realized what the EU has done regarding COVID and vaccines and the recovery plan, or with the maintenance of the opening of borders in very complex situations, or the joint procurement, but those that try and find information know this. The problem that I believe the EU has, or the European institutions, or what happens is that the media is in the different states and in the capitals of the different member states, and that's where we can really decide what we communicate, what is being told, and how it's being told. And this is very much more complex from Brussels, because in Brussels we work as if we were a foreign capital. We have correspondents as if they worked in a third country and not in the capital of the EU, and they don't have the means nor in the editorial independence necessary to explain this is everything that is happening in Brussels, and this is what I need to narrate, and I can limit myself to the crisis or delays or what's going wrong or the confrontations. I should also be able to find the spaces to tell the 80 or 90% of the things that are being solved and that are being that are progressing. So before saying it, we have to work on this narrative. We would have to see if we have and what we do to have the adequate channels that really allow to disseminate the information to the citizenship. And then we have the message and the narrative. And here I would go back to what I said at the beginning. A fundamental narrative is the narrative of values, but what's understood better by people during times of crisis is the narrative of efficiency. If we solve the problems of citizens, obviously we won't have any legitimacy problems. If we're not able to solve these problems, and beyond this there's someone that advertises another way of solving them and seem to solve it in a better way, but if it's not true, then we face a problem with the narrative. And here we should have to be less naive and to also introduce marketing elements. That's something that I believe that now the Commission is starting to do in a better way than previous commissions, but there's still a lot to get done. I remember I would have to almost bite my nails. I believe it was at the end of 2020, no, at the beginning of 2021, when Joe Biden spent 2 weeks saying that in the US they were vaccinating 1 million Americans every day. At that same time in Europe we were vaccinating every day 3 million Europeans, 3 million citizens. The Americans were able to sell this message, and it was more difficult for us. And I will stop here.
Yeah, no, I agree with those remarks. I think the key is to be able to show that the EU actually delivers more than we commonly give it credit for, and especially in times of crisis. And I think the trap that we often fall into is to compare the EU to the United States or any state. Now, the EU is not a state. So if the EU is then tasked to manage crises, it doesn't have the same effectiveness as a state might have. So then it's very easy to become negative about the EU and say, okay, it's slow, it's bureaucratic, it never takes decisions. But that we have to accept that for the time being, we are an association of states, and therefore any decision taken by the EU needs a lot of support among other states, and that slows us down. So I think part of the communications challenge is also to make that clear. That actually, if the fact that we were, and the EU was able to act decisively in a number of crises now, is actually a huge accomplishment, given that it is not a unitary, centrally run state. And I agree with what you said about this being both a problem of the message and also of the delivery mechanisms of the message. But I think it should start with addressing the message. And from that point, you talk about how to disseminate information to either your own people or the world.
Hemos empezado un poquito más tarde, entonces.
We have started a bit late, so I do have one last question. In fact, I have many others ready, but I wasn't able to ask many of them, and then very soon I will give you the floor. But as we have the High Representative with us, I have a question that has to do with the EU structures and related to its narrative. My question is, and I ask you, if the EU would have a foreign affairs minister, could this benefit its narrative? Would there be a before and an after, or would nothing change? When the European Constitution was approved in that project, they talked about the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And this is one of the things that changed later when people from France and the Netherlands rejected this project, and it became a treaty. So we lost a percentage, quantitatively not so much, qualitatively I think that much more, and we lost symbology, because symbology is important as well as names and titles. So if the High Representative was called Minister, this might help communication, because people understand what a Foreign Affairs Minister is more than a High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security. Having said this, if you ask Mr. Borrell, and you can do so, if he would prefer to be minister or to have more powers, probably he would choose to have more powers, because at the end of the day, what's important is to be able to get things done. So the name might not be the best in the world, but the British continue to work with almost medieval names. The ministers sometimes have names that no one understands, but at the end of the day, the Exchequer, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has the power of the budget, and it wouldn't matter if he's the finance minister or if he's giving any other, he or she's giving any other name. So what's important here is the action, capacity, powers, and how to be able to reach consensus between member states, avoiding vetoes, which I believe is one of the daily battles of the Foreign Affairs Minister, but I won't take more time from him. Well, first of all, I apologize for being able to be here for the whole session. That was very interesting for me, and I'm sure it's very interesting, but the world doesn't stop, and my telephone never stops, so unfortunately I wasn't able to join you for the whole thing. Jaume is very right. The name is important, but what's most important is what you can get done. If the name would be easier, it would make things easier for me too, because no one says the name correctly. They even here they call me very weird names. High Commissioner, but people really don't know what the name is, because High Representative, even translated to Spanish, sounds even weirder. But it is true. Sometimes the name has its importance, and when it was going to be a minister, that British decided that it shouldn't be so by argumenting that ministers are members of a government, and that the government is the one in the states, that the EU is not a state and therefore doesn't have a government and therefore doesn't have ministers. And the reasoning is correct. Yes, they're right. To be a minister, you need to be part of a government, and the EU doesn't have a government, it's not a state, and it doesn't have a foreign policy. Foreign policy and defense policy continues to be a competence of power of each of the states. They each have one, and they protect it very much. So the high rep, which is the easiest way of calling me, you can call me high rep if you want to, because that's how they call me in Brussels. Now they start to say high commissioner and things like that that don't make sense. But what I have to do is to try and find common denominators. A common denominator that is not so small that it's irrelevant. We agree in almost nothing, or sometimes we reach an agreement when there's an empty agreement. That's what makes it more difficult. Do not forget, Jaume, the communication difficulties that are linked to the bipolarity or or the two pillars in that are the Council and the Commission. And when I say Council, which Council? The European Council, headed by Michel, or the Council of the European Union that I head in some places, and then the ministers of the presidency in others. So there is a complex communication because it's complex. I don't know, many people differentiate between the European Council and the Council of Europe and so on and so forth. It's very difficult for people to understand what they do. In the Crimean summit, all the states were represented by one person, but the EU was represented by two, the President of the Council and the President of the Commission. Two, because they have two different things to say? No, they have one thing to say, one narrative, the union's narrative. But once there are two spokespersons, then the narrative becomes more complex because one explains one side, another explains the other. Of course, there's overlapping unavoidably, and this is part of this institutional complex situation that up till now will continue to be what it is. And of course, I would prefer to be called whatever, but that they will allow me to be able to decide with a qualified majority than needing a unanimity but being called minister. The battle of explaining what we do is, I would say, I don't know what you've said till now, but I would say that we are not winning this battle. And sometimes when we say that things are done, there's a negative effect worldwide. For example, when yesterday we talked about vaccines, I say Europe is the one that has done most for the rest of the world, much more than Russia and China. And immediately there are voices from Africa that say, wait a minute, don't be so happy and pleased, because what you've done is insufficient in comparison to my needs. And you said that the vaccine was a world public asset and that no one would be safe till we all had it. And the reality, as the Europeans have been vaccinated 3 times, and in Africa we're in a 16% of the first vaccine. So we've done more than anyone, but it's still insufficient. So the battle of the glass half full, half empty, depends on who's looking at the glass, and this is part of the intrinsic complexity, and it exists in any communication. So we have many institutional agents. For example, we have a rotatory presidency, and then we have the presidency of the Council, of the Commission. So the everyday citizen doesn't understand the mechanism for decision making, and it should be simplified. Now we go to the audience. To start with, I have 2 ladies here that want to participate. 3. A real success. Let's start over here. short questions and one question if possible. We'll take this first three to start with.
Señor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. For 15 years, I've been an MP in Europe. But first of all, I would like to congratulate you because for the first time, I have the impression that Europeans feel that there is a representative for foreign policy with a skill and a capacity, a way of representing your role in a fair manner that is providing a lot to citizens. So my congratulations. In the 15 years I've been there, and there's something I would like to say before my question. I believe Europe has always been limited in its communication capacity because of the different governments. Europe restructured its communication but wasn't able to design a real communication model. And you can see this even in the MPs in the parliament that have to communicate through spokespeople to the fact that the communication, what is communicating is what is being done but not what we are. I believe that people don't perceive Europe only for what they do, but it disseminates and communicates every time they have a meeting. And they say, we're going to give this money, we're working on this program. But Europe is, and it has an important identity. And that's my question. I believe a big step has been given in the EU in these years on the concept of democracy and space of rights, a place where freedoms are defended, a space of freedom based on the law and democracy. And I believe there's a lack of democracy and something that Europe should work on because it's surveyed and limited by the member states. And that is to selling its democratic capacity. And this is something that they're not working more. In the European programs, they talk about integrity and so on, but do they talk about the defense of the democratic system? The concept of democracy, and that's a question that I also asked Mr. Borrell, is part of the defense of Ukraine before Russia. Ukrainians want to continue being free, even if there's corruption, but they want to be there and not in the other model. And I believe values, and I answer your second question that I loved. Yes, and access is the democratic system because Europe is a space of democracy and freedoms. So has this concept been perceived by Russia? In all the years that you've been working, do you understand why people is willing even to die and sacrifice their lives for something?
Lo de morir.
Well, about dying, well, fortunately, we had abolished war as part from our collective imagery. Wars was from others, not in Europe. So we hope that we would like for no one to die. But it's true what you're saying. At the end of the day, Putin fears more a democratic Ukraine that is fully democratized and solves its problems that it has, and many, to be a full democracy, the style of other Western democracies. They fear this more than the military deployment of NATO.
El espacio democrático.
The democratic space. Do you think it's the key element to defend the identity of the EU beyond what Europe is doing, and if they all the measures that are being put in place, should they defend their identity in a deeper manner?
I agree with. It's more than freedom. I think it's a way of life, and I think if you look at it, I think the quality of life in Europe is it's more pleasant and comfortable to live in Europe than it is in probably any place in the world. And that's partly connected to freedom, but it's also connected to social measures that are put in place and some trivial things like work and life balance. But I fervently believe, and I think most of us do, in the European model, in the way of life, but it's under threat, and it's about convincing others that this is actually a good way of life. And that is not so easily done. And I agree with the High Rep that we're losing the battle.
Bueno, yo creo que el problema digamos, de
I guess that I've addressed that during my talk. The issue of the defense of democracy in EU is just like the air you breathe when you just don't realize when you don't have this air, you do not appreciate it on a daily basis. But I feel that the European institutions are fighting a battle in certain member states to defend a certain degree of democracy, to keep on calling them fully democratic countries. Sometimes this can be seen easily from abroad than in the States. That I think that this could be clearly seen, because you might find more European flags in Kiev than in Budapest, for example. So we carry on with the questions. 3 more questions.
También de blanco el chico joven y el señor de rojo. Es que hay muchísimas.
There are many questions. Question for both speakers. How long can stay alive a Chinese regime with cultural progress that is happening today? Another one. I would like you to talk about the possibilities to have this information to be successful. This information is proposed by Russia, but this information is proposed by national actors in the Ukrainian war. Those who defended an abstention to war, there were political parties from Spain or other European parties, and they did it. There were Spanish actors, and in this context, the Spanish actors are giving us alternatives, and that we are trying to avoid that. I would also you to talk about when we talk about abstract ideas as freedom, etc., but those who cannot, who haven't got food, or they are facing terrible inequalities. How can you talk to those people? How can we have a narrative if the material reality is not the best one? Thank you. And if I may, I want to bring about a nuance. I'm going to read a quote for you to understand what is this information. This is a quote from Margarita Simonial, the General Director of Russia Today. This is from the webpage on disinformation that is directed by Arrupes, the High Representative for High Representative. It is the Spanish translation for High Rep, Arrupes. So, High Representative. Okay, it's quite funny. Arrupes. So, and I quote, Russia today is needed for the same reason than the country needs a Ministry of Defense. Russia today is able to carry out an information battle against the Western world using information. And Margarita Simonial says that the objective of Russia today is to conquer and have audiences that could be mobilized in favor of Russia in critical moments. So are we far from this situation in the States? We are facing a war of information, and I think that we are playing with the two arms that are tight behind our shoulders, behind our back, sorry. I would like to talk about the hypocrisy of the third countries. I work in Oxfam Intermon, and they are caring about the interest of the global south. They're very critical with the attitudes not only of the EU but of the Western Bloc. In such a world order where the European Union has to find a legitimacy in its action and mustn't be seen as someone using its interests but also using values to mislead us. There are two examples that are very different. This is the international agreement on taxation with its two pillars. They have fill in the gaps of the international fiscal system. This is going to be this agreement that amounts to a high degree of money collection has been led by the G7 and then to the G20, and then we left the countries in development participate. There are many voices that haven't participated in the negotiation on an equal basis, but just at the end of the process there is another example, which is the Paris Agreement. And in the framework of the United Nations, it is important to talk about the frame. The Paris Agreement, the developing countries have participated until the end, and we have committed ourselves to reduce, etc., in the horizon 2050. And I think the EU is able to demand the commitment and the fulfilling the requirements. We have got China, the United States, Europe, without Trump, but also there is a greater legitimacy to sell our interest in what we think the climate diplomacy and the external dimension of the Green Deal. That there are more hypocrisy than in other places. So as there are many, we have many questions. We distribute the questions. We do not have to answer to all the questions. So I just wanted to add something to what Nacho has just mentioned. There is a before and after the ban to Russia today. Have you seen that? Have you observed the difference? And that's all.
I have not. And I think that the influence of Russia today on public opinion in Europe has always been very limited. And I think it just gets who watches it. Few people watch it. It has very low viewer rates. So I think the influence of Russia today in Europe is limited. But as I said in my argument, I think the impact of what Russia and China do in the world, not necessarily of RT, but in the world through various instruments of narrative power are more profound. And in Europe, I think what Nacho was saying, or somebody else was saying, that we have lots of other actors who spread illiberal anti-democratic information. And I'm always, you mentioned some in Spain, but I mean, but look at the Brexit discussion in the UK. Now, who really influenced the UK voter to vote for Brexit more? Was it the Sun, the tabloid newspapers, or was it RT? And I think that I haven't done it, but if you do a study, an empirical study, you'll probably find the influence of RT being a drop in an ocean of disinformation fanned by long-established, very British national newspapers.
Yo esperaba que hablaras de China, porque yo de China sé muy poco, pero...
I hoped you were going to talk about China, but I'm going to be a bit harsh. The great success of the Chinese is that they have joined the advantages of the capitalism and communism, and they've set aside the disadvantages of the one and the other. So this has enabled them to progress economically, and also they don't have to care about problems of how our society reacts to the measures they adopt. And it has become a very popular country in certain third countries because they give helps, although they're not really helps or aids. But they, because they demand people to submit themselves, but they do not require to have any kind of test of being complying with the human rights. When talking about disinformation, I have barely talked about that this information, but in the case of Russians, Chinese have another way of disinformation. But in the case of Russians, they use a lot what we call the proxies. The third, there could be media, pro-Kremlin. They are internal actors of the society or the country you are talking about or aiming at. And there is a second element, and I've mentioned it, is that you won't be able to bring about your own messages. You will polarize the discussion of the questions already addressed in that country: immigration, migration, or the Catalan independence of Catalonia, or other questions. And if we do not solve our own social problems, we will be quite vulnerable in the face of this criticism, even though this criticism is unfair and has no relation with the country where it takes place. But also we have the question of the non-intervention. You do not influence trying to count or votes or suppress votes or creating cyber security concerns, because these things are quite controlled. But you have an influence in the increase of a certain number of ideologies or political parties that are more extremes, and you are going to foster those through through media, and you will do that with the help, without being aware, with the help of some media that are going to take these debates of the social media as a genuine debate or discussion, and they are going to transfer this social media debate to the traditional media. And how can you do that? You do that through funding political parties. And currently one of the questions addressed in the European institutions is the ban of foreign funding of public or private entities outside Europe of certain political parties, because through this path of training in communication and disinformation is how you're going to polarize the society, you're going to divide the society, and this is going to lead to a situation as the one we are seeing in certain member states that I'm not going to name now. But as Nacho has mentioned, we are we cannot do nothing because we live in a rule of law, and we cannot we cannot say to someone not to talk because there's a freedom of speech. We cannot imprison someone, and but these things are happening in those countries. I refer to Russia or China, for example. When talking about taxation, yesterday I listened to the debate. You talked a lot about the double standard, and it is quite clear, I guess, that the EU has problems of credibility in certain regions of the world. These issues come back from the colonialism, for example. In certain African countries, things are seen differently, or they might be related to our compliance with the US policies, our relationship with some certain countries in Latin America, and in questions of international policies where sometimes we apply this double standard. And when talking about Brexit, of course, the British tabloids have more influence than RT. Not only RT, but the disinformation in English that it comes from the Kremlin world is quite controlled, but the information in many other languages, starting from Spanish, no. We have done a lot with certain platforms, Google, YouTube, where of course we can we achieve certain results when using English language, but there are languages as important as English, for example, Spanish for Latin American countries, where the efforts have been very few, and they have great influence then. And in respecting to Brexit, the disinformation of Brexit is not only the 3 months previous to the referendum, but it is the disinformation of the 30 previous years. This information is created and it is maintained and multiplied in London.
Una pregunta. ¿Me dan permiso para una pregunta?
Only one question, sorry.
Mira, allí hay dos que se mantienen firmes. Entonces, los dos, venga, los dos.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta. Mi pregunta.
Thank you. What is the communication capacity of the EU regarding two aspects? A study that has been carried out by the Spanish ambassador in Albania and has carried out a study talking with a consultant of the US presidents, and he talked about two issues. I would like to know, what do you think about that? The first, the plurality of institutions. The president of the state did not like the meetings with the representatives. Everybody wanted to talk, the ministers wanted to talk, the representatives of the commission, and he was fed up. He talks about the fact that he told to someone, don't do again that to me. And the number of summits was reduced as a consequence. And they talked about the low political profile of the representatives of the EU. Two exceptions, one was Borrell, but they also talked about the fact that the representative of the Commission or the Parliament, they said that Tony Blair wasn't elected because of a political battle. And all that makes very difficult a relationship where there is a good relationship and a balanced relationship. And so, do you agree with this? And what could we do to avoid this situation, because in communication, not only with citizens, but we should also solve this problem in other areas. Thank you.
Hola, intentaré ser breve ya que soy la última.
Hello, I try to be brief. Narratives have always been present throughout history, but now they are disseminated in a different way. But they have always been characterized by these simple messages, or citizenship is really not smart. When Russia said, "Oh, in Ukraine there are Nazis," is public less informed? Or, for example, when they said the Catalans said Spain is a thief, for example. These messages are a bit silly, but people believe in that. They are based upon simple messages, and they're fake news. Is this called narrative, or is it disinformation? Simply disinformation, because we get those messages, and I feel, and I don't know, they are like mantras. If you repeat the same fake news, people end up by believing that, because if I have to believe that in Ukraine they are Nazis, it's difficult. Thank you.
¿Quién empieza primero? Hans, Jaume.
Bueno, sobre la primera pregunta, de hecho, Josep Borrell ya ha
Regarding the first question, Josep Borrell has answered to that. There is a great complexity in the decision-making process and the representativity of the EU. I'm not going to talk about the famous coach gate. I've got my ideas, and we discussed about it to structure the EU. Maybe we do not need a president of the Commission or a president of the European Council. Maybe we could only have one presidency, and it would be simpler. Or maybe we could say who is representing us abroad, or in which domains. For example, for intern affairs is one person, and for the external one it is someone else. I think all politics have internal and external matters. So I guess you have given it a touch of humor, but of course when the European delegation is presented, we do not need a map to, we need a map to see who are the representatives if they all go together. Otherwise it's very difficult. But Josep Borrell has talked about that, so I'm not going to talk more about that. Talking about the basic messages are the ones who work. So for us, it seems impossible and silly, but it is true. One of the tactics of the disinformation is to repeat once and again, the message, and it becomes a truth, even though it is a lie. There are neo-Nazis in Ukraine. The Russians spent years saying Ukraine is a country full of Nazis. So from the first day of the invasion, this message increases. So these media are going to talk about that one, about these Nazis, and it seems absurd and silly. But why does it work? Because this message is not delivered on the 24th of February, but it is quite old. It might not work outside Russia, but it works well in Russia, this message.
The only thing I had to add on that last point is that you talked a bit about short mantras and disinformation. I think that the two are not necessarily the same. Yeah. And I think that if we have a true narrative, if you want to call it true, you will also need a mantra to effectively communicate it to citizens. Yeah, so part of the challenge, you can have a very long narrative. I spoke for 20 minutes, too long. But in order to communicate to citizens, you must be able to compress it into 5 words, and that is not disinformation, that is effective communication, and that's very difficult. But it's part of what the EU must do better. On the other question, I think on the EU's capacity to communicate, I think the EU or the Commission I know best, and I think the Commission is an effective communicator, but for the audiences it is mostly trying to address, which are what they call in Brussels stakeholders. So, and citizens are not necessarily stakeholders. Stakeholders are organizations, companies, or NGOs, trade bodies, and other member states, and the international business community. So the Commission is quite effective communicating on single market policy, on business-related things, but it has never, in its entire history, been very good at reaching the citizen. And it has never been very good at thinking through the importance of what you say geopolitically. So if there are 3 pillars to communication, let's say stakeholder, economy, citizen, and international diplomacy, then we are okay on the first one, but on the 2 other pillars we are so far doing poorly. And that is partly the history of what Brussels and the EU is, because it was largely about the single market for a long time. And then that you can also communicate that to citizens, and you should. But we simply communicate it very much to direct stakeholders, companies, and that we can do well. So there's much to learn there.
Vale.
Solo, bueno, no, que despide, pero porque si no la gente se va muy rápido. Mañana empezamos a las 9:30. Tomorrow at 9:30.
Tomorrow.
Que uno de los ponentes tienen que coger un vuelo, o sea que os pedimos un esfuerzo para estar aquí a las 9:30 en punto mañana. Y ahora, Catalina.
We ask you to be here tomorrow at 9:30, sorry. So, we have had a lot of time. It has been great. We have reached the end of this session, and it has been really fascinating. The EU is a privileged space, an oasis in the world, and so we are really fortunate to be a part of this collective construction. Its defense should be our mission. A powerful narrative that has been described by two speakers are the best building blocks to build Europe inside and abroad. Media, the public media mostly, are the best to disseminate and reinforce this narrative. The media, we are fighting against disinformation that are creating a bad narrative. So that's why many media, as EFE, has opened units to verify and to check the news. Thank you very much.
Sí.